Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. Listeners have asked us to provide pointers to some of the resources we talk about on the show. We now have links to books and articles referenced in recent podcasts that are available on our website. We also offer full transcripts. Go to jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com. Today's guest is Damien Walter. Damien's a writer and a storyteller. He's written for The Guardian, the BBC, Wired, Independent, Aeon, and others. And he teaches the rhetoric of story and writing the 21st century myth to over 35,000 students worldwide. And he's host of the quite interesting science fiction podcast. You can learn more about him at damiengwalter.com, Damien G. Walter at Medium. He has a Substack at Damien, and the podcast Science Fiction by Damien Walter. Of course, all those links will be on the Jim Rutt Show episode page at jimruttshow.com. So, welcome back. We tried to record this the other day, and due to technical difficulties, it didn't work, so we're going to start from the top. One of the things I noticed when I looked at your website is that you pitched, I think it was your course, what happens when logos meets mythos, reason meets imagination, and science meets fiction. The first thought that leapt into my head was, what about pathos and ethos? You know, the old classic aspects of Greek story architecture. You know, one of my first loves in science fiction, Heinlein, was really big on ethos. In fact, I'd argue in some sense his whole set of works was about what is it to be a right person, right? And on the other hand, science fiction has often been criticized for being thin on pathos. So, Damien, take it away.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. On our second attempt here, Jim. I'm honored that you've woken up so early to have me back on the podcast.
Yeah, I wanted to get back on because I did all my prep, and in my semi-senile state, the retention period isn't what it used to be, so I wanted to get it back as quickly as possible so I could remember who the hell it was I was talking to.
Well, hopefully I remember what I'm doing. Yeah, that's an interesting story. I mean, I'm a lifelong science fiction fan. I'm a third generation science fiction fan, actually. So my grandfather was into Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and had a large collection of those books. I never got to meet him, unfortunately. And then my mum, so it went through the maternal line then to my mum, who was really big into, well, I guess, fantasy for many people, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and also read like a lot of Arthur C. Clarke. So when I was about 6 or 7, I was already reading a lot of Arthur C. Clarke and Tolkien and Lewis, and that has just became like a lifelong fascination with science fiction, which now at the age of 45 has never really left me behind. And really, I'm a frustrated storyteller. I'm trying to write like my own, at some point, Lord of the Rings, maybe. So through my life, I've tried to learn as much about story and science fiction and fantasy and myth making as well. That's become over many different phases of my life. And that led me, at one point, I wrote for The Guardian for like 6 or 7 years, a regular column on science fiction, more focused on books, and got to know lots and lots of people in the science fiction writing world and community. I studied in America for 6 weeks on the Clarion Writers Workshop, where I got to meet lots of cool people. But I kind of took a little break from science fiction and was doing other things. And then during COVID, one of the things I do is curate online courses. The first of those was the Rhetoric of Story, which actually has over 50,000 students worldwide now on online platforms, which is really cool. And then, during the COVID lockdown, I came back to thinking a lot about science fiction. I reread stuff that I was catching up with and started putting together basically my second big course, which is called Writing the 21st Century Myth. And the thesis of the course is about how science fiction is modern myth making. And I wanted to talk to a range of people. So I arranged an interview. I was very lucky. I caught John Vervaeke, who I know you know very well. He's a regular guest on your podcast. And he agreed to do an interview with me. He's actually a science fiction and a Star Trek fan. We've just recently, this week, in fact, done another chat together about Star Trek. So that'll be coming out at some point. But in that conversation about science fiction, we went through loads and loads of things. But at one point, we were talking about science fiction and what these two words mean. And that I was interested that they had kind of opposite meanings. And John talked about them as a symbolon. That in this collision of opposite meanings is like quite a potent symbol. On the one hand, science, our way of determining what is true and real, and on the other hand, fiction, which is untrue and unreal, but it might have deeper truths that are revealed in it. So as I was building up my course, this became the science fiction podcast. I started putting some of the lectures on there and the YouTube videos I was making. And I was quite surprised that this built up quite an audience, actually. So we've been in the top 10 of the podcast charts in about 70 different countries now, which is cool. So then I actually started running it properly as a podcast and trying to link together all of these ideas about reality and fantasy and mythos and logos, which is maybe the root of these ideas, or logos and mythos, these ancient, well, classical Greek terms. From one hand, the logos, which is all your kind of logic and reasoning, and the mythos, which is all the stories of your culture. And of course, Greek culture has this amazing mythos, which has still come down to us today. So that's the root of that, and a bit of a way into my interest in, I guess, how science fiction is making modern myths for us today. So I hope that answers your question, Jim.
Well, you didn't say why you didn't put some emphasis also on pathos and ethos.
Well, they do come in. There's a strong link between mythos and pathos. In one gives you, your mythos gives you your kind of heightened stories of what humans may be able to achieve, our heroic side. But in storytelling terms, the pathos is the reality of life, the grittiness of existence. And historically, we haven't done a lot of, well, maybe we haven't recorded a lot of the pathos of our storytelling. It tends to be the mythic stories that survive through history. But you get that divide today between like literary fiction, which is apparently looking at the pathos of life, although I think there are elements of the constructed and the fantasy in there as well. And on the other hand, what's often kind of dismissed as genre fiction, where a lot of science fiction and fantasy and horror and so on sit. In terms of the ethos, I mean, I think about that a lot on the Rhetoric of Story. That's kind of a major element of thinking about storytelling. But I haven't really thought about it in relation to science fiction, or whether science fiction is where we often turn to for our exemplars of how to live. Of course, in a heroic sense. But I guess we do get the figure of like the scientist, billionaire, industrialist from there. Elon Musk has very successfully like embodied in our culture, or the scientist who manages to put together a time machine in their basement and go traveling through history. And I think that might be an archetype that we've drawn from science fiction. I don't know, what do you think, Jim?
I think there's lots of interesting ethos in science fiction, but not in all of science fiction. As I mentioned, I always thought Heinlein was great. Farnham's Freehold, the libertarian dude, but who's loyal to the death, right? And perhaps my favorite character in all of Heinlein, Jubal Harshaw, the lawyer in Stranger in a Strange Land. I suppose if I have any fictional characters I based myself on, it would be a cross between Jubal Harshaw and Gandalf. No, actually not Gandalf, Tom Bombadil. Even better, right? And I got a friend who actually sort of models himself on Michael Valentine Smith, the Martian in Stranger in a Strange Land. So there is that, how to live. And I think that's actually always one of the reasons we read fiction, is to get some insight into how other people think that right living might be. And of course, some of it's just pure entertainment, genre fiction, the thriller type stuff, the pure mechanical crank them out. And there's a lot of science fiction that's like that too. But, science fiction at its greatest, I think, often does include ethos, though it does tend to be thin on pathos. I do read a lot of literary fiction, and it is too much pathos in my book, right? It's like, all right, whiny fuckers, shut the fuck up and go do something, right?
Yeah, if it doesn't leave you feeling chronically depressed, it's not great literature.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a total optimist, and is totally not that way. But I nonetheless enjoy reading as an insight into how other people think. So anyway, I think that's interesting. So let's move on a little bit. Let's start out with one of the classic science fiction arguments. Are you a Star Trek or a Star Wars guy? If you have to pick one.
I'm more a Star Trek guy. I mean, Star Wars was the first time I saw Star Wars was very early in the VHS video machine days. And I was so obsessed with it that my mother actually had to borrow the video machine from the family who had it. So we could take that home and I could watch it like 6 times in a row. But it didn't last for me as something I was really interested in. I've watched like all of the movies, I guess. And I think the recent Andor show is really good. But I'm much more a Star Trek person, especially Next Generation. Next Generation, Deep Space Nine are my 2 big Star Trek obsessions. And I would watch them obsessively when I was in my late teens and early 20s because there's such a beautiful vision of humanity as at our most like orderly and logical and positive and progressive as a species. Unless you go to the mirror dimension, which I think is always a kind of in-joke for the people making Trek, especially the actors, that they have a feeling that this is a bit more what the characters would actually be like if they had more pathos to them.
Spock with pathos, there's an interesting concept, right? Of course, the old argument would be that he was riddled with emotions, but just couldn't let it out because of his raising. Yeah, I would also come down on the side of Star Trek. However, I would also say that I remember watching the original Star Trek show when it came out, and it was like very riveting, even though later when you go back and look at those things, the production values are so low, it's so cheesy, it's hilarious. But at the time, it was like so much better and more interesting and deep than any other network TV show, at least in the United States. But I have never watched, other than maybe one episode each of some of the follow-on series, the Next Generation or Deep Space Nine or was it Battlestar Galactica? Was that part of Star Trek? No, I think that was like a ripoff of Star Trek. But anyway, I'm kind of anchored on the original. I have watched, I think, all the movies, and I have always enjoyed those. But yes, I also come down as a Star Trek guy. I did watch Star Wars, including the night it came out. A buddy of mine at the time, we were pseudo-cinephiles. We had this theory that if you didn't watch it the first night, the film had been degraded by running through the machine. We were, idiots, but so we went and saw it the first night, waited in line, long line, all that stuff. And I still have the same simple critique of Star Wars. As a good American gun nut, I do a lot of shooting, have been involved with gun sports and things of that sort. The damn troopers in Star Wars are the worst shots imaginable. I would love to go through and count how many shots they shoot that don't hit anything. That just seems to be like a cheap storytelling technique that they use throughout that whole series. So all these bullets flying, nobody ever gets hit by the troopers. The Empire's stormtroopers are the worst shots in all of cinema. And as a gun person, I just find that an objectionable cheat.
You have to accept Star Wars as what it is. There's a great story that Mark Hamill tells where he says that he was pointing out to Harrison Ford, he was like, after the trash compactor scene, he said, look, we're all dry now. Shouldn't we still be wet? And Harrison Ford just turns to him and says, it ain't that kind of film, kid. Star Wars just isn't. It's a mythic, heroic storytelling in space. But I accept it as science fiction. And I've been arguing about that this week with the members of my science fiction community on Facebook. We have 26,000 members on there, and it's very active as well. So we have arguments that go on for days and days and days. And we've been talking about whether Star Wars is actually science fiction or not. That's
a damn interesting question, because you think about it, it does have, the Force and kind of that Yoda and kind of the woo-ish stuff to it. So does that push it over the line into fantasy or not? Of course, to my mind, that line between fantasy and science fiction, there really isn't a crisp line in my book. So if you had a big old map, I'll just make up an answer here. What the hell, right? It's science fiction near the boundary with fantasy and maybe a little overlap, something like that.
Yeah. Well, science fiction fans tend to be obsessive categorizers, which is why there's so many different subgenres of science fiction as well. So I think the science fiction fantasy divide is kind of an artificial categorization. I think they're the same thing that manifests in different ways. They're both kind of big mythic storytelling. And then what happened in the science fiction world was that because there were these two categories that lots of things fell between, there's also a subgenre of science fantasy, which many people categorize Star Wars as. But for me, the label science fantasy doesn't really make any sense, because I think if you were going to change a word, it would be the science bit. And maybe you would call it fantasy fiction instead. But I do have some reasoning for why I think Star Wars is science fiction. I think it's all about how far you extend science, really. There's that famous line from Arthur C. Clarke where he says any sufficiently advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic. If you backwards engineer that idea, wherever we push our technology to, it's going to end up looking kind of magical to us, because we always use our technology to fulfill our will in the world, our ability to do things. So if you extend that either 1,000 years in the future or to a galaxy far, far away, you can have a technological explanation for everything in Star Trek, including the Force, if you want one. And a lot of the ideas come from other science fiction. A lot of them come from Isaac Asimov, actually, like the hyperdrive. That's something that Asimov explored first, the idea of hyperspace as a means of traveling between star systems, which for me is one of the more realistic, actually, forms of interstellar travel for something that may never be possible for us.
Yeah, and of course, that's one of the interesting things about science fiction. You make a couple of these key extrapolations, either reasonable or not, and then you base a whole world upon that. It's funny, I was a hardcore nonfiction reader. I started reading science books when I was 5, and I was fortunately tall. When you went to the library during class, when you were in first grade, they made you get books from the kids' shelf, stupid ass Dr. Seuss books and shit like that. I had no interest in those, but I discovered by accident, if I stopped by the library after school on the way to the school bus, particularly if you're tall, they didn't know who the hell you were. They didn't care what book you took out. So I started taking out science books, and that's all I read. Science books, a little bit of history. And then fortunately, I had a pretty wise third grade teacher who actually took me personally to the school library and handed me a book by someone named Andre Norton, and said, "You might like this." And I read it, and I go, "It's kind of cool." I read a bunch of her stuff, and then I got into Heinlein and a few others. And then the gateway, I made the giant mistake of reading the Foundation trilogy when I was 10. And I've found a lot of people who, for whatever reason, did that. And I think you mentioned the idea of psychohistory is a dangerously bad idea. And I think it took me years to be deprogrammed from the concept that, with enough knowledge, we could predict the future 10,000 years in the future or something. And it's funny, I am now, of course, a complexity science guy. I've been affiliated with the Santa Fe Institute for 20 years. And one of the main holdings of complexity science is we don't know shit about the future. That the unfolding of high-dimensional complex systems, particularly agentic ones, i.e. ones with animals in them that can have agency, is so unpredictable that you shouldn't even try to think you could model out a complex system in any detail very far off. And so, in fact, at Santa Fe Institute, it's somewhat of an insult to call somebody Harry Seldon.
Well, I think Asimov would appreciate that. I think psychohistory is an idea that he came up with when he was very young. And he ended up in the science fiction world, and he met up with John W. Campbell, the great science fiction editor. And Campbell was trying to change science fiction, which in American magazine publishing was super pulpy. and had a very low reputation. And he is really the editor that gives the idea of science fiction having some real grounding in science, as opposed to just being fantasy like Buck Rogers, perhaps. So he's trying to find writers to do that. And Asimov has a pitch meeting with him, basically. And Asimov has been reading, I forget the name, Edward Gibbon, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, which is this really foundational history for the liberal conception of history, basically, that history progresses over time. And Gibbon had extrapolated this from the history of the Roman Empire into modernity. So Foundation draws on all of that. So very loosely, the Foundation is kind of the Americas and the colonies, and the empire that's collapsing is the British Empire, or you could cast it as the Roman Empire as well. But it's all about like the evolution of civilizations. So he has to put something at the heart of this. So he has the idea of psychohistory, which I think is a brilliant idea to have when you're 22 or something, that he had it. But in the later books, he starts taking it apart and showing how the history can't really be guided this way, because I think he's done much more thinking about politics and geopolitics and so on at that point. Did you read the later books, Jim?
What do you mean the later books?
Well, he wrote the original trilogy, and then there are later Foundation books. I'm not sure when the fourth one is, but then the fifth one is like the late 1980s, and it was actually Asimov's big bestseller at the time.
I did not. I read a fair bit of Asimov, but I eventually got tired of his fairly pedestrian writing style. Though I did one time, this is an interesting science fiction, weird little autobiographical fact. Totally forgot about this. I read Asimov's famous story, The Last Question, and I was so taken by it, I read it over the phone to my high school girlfriend. The whole thing.
How did that go?
She loved it.
Okay.
She was a nerd girl, so what the hell, right?
As a teenager, I was very into Dune and the Dune movie, David Lynch's Dune movie. And I probably showed it to like 2 or 3 girlfriends who all broke up with me soon afterwards, until I twigged that's why it was, I think.
Interesting. Let's move on to another near topic. I noticed on your podcast, was it your podcast or was it on your Guardian? I don't remember because I did a little float around, that you wrote something, The Truth of Myth, J.R.R. Tolkien and the Return of the Mythos. Tolkien is one of my favorites. I have read Lord of the Rings 34 times, including about 6 months ago. Every year or two, I go back and dig into it. And, it is, to my mind, just the best example so far of somebody creating a really, really interesting, complicated world that has all those elements of logos, mythos, pathos, and ethos.
Yeah, I mean, the Lord of the Rings, so that's actually the last part of my course. It's the 9th lecture, because I had this ongoing back and forth in the course Writing the 21st Century Myth about what the value of myth is. Because you can think of myth as fantasy, so humans have just been inventing fantasies for thousands of years that make us feel better about the world, fantasies of gods and heroes, and we can tell these stories and really, really enjoy them. They make us feel better about our place in the world, but we don't have to imbue them with any more meaning than that. But then, of course, like myths are the foundation of all our great religions, so we do have real belief in them as well. So the 8th talk is about fantasy and what we do with fantasy storytelling. And then the 9th one, I turn that the other way and ask, when we tell mythic stories, do they communicate some real picture of the world beyond our ability to understand it? And I think I'm not a full Tolkien scholar, so more knowledgeable Tolkien scholars might correct me or argue with me. But I think Tolkien saw myth that way. I think he saw it as a picture of the truest reality in the way that many very religious people do. And Tolkien was a pretty devout Catholic, as was Lewis as well, his great friend. And I think the two of them together with their compatriot whose name has fallen out of my head, and he was quite a famous British philosopher and also a theosophist who had very deep spiritual beliefs about the nature of myth. And both Lewis and Tolkien were in a kind of a trio. They were all members of the Inklings together. And I think from that, Lewis and Tolkien went in different directions. So Lewis very kind of literally represented the Christian mythos in Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and the Land of Narnia, through to killing his messianic character, Aslan. But I think for a lot of people that when I discovered when I was about 12, and I was already at the time very atheist, very anti-God, and when I discovered it was a Christian allegory, I was very angry with Lewis, actually, genuinely quite angry. But Tolkien goes another way. He's not writing allegorically. He's very keen to make that point to people who talk to him about Lord of the Rings. He is trying to do what he talks about as mythopoeia, which is the art of creating a new mythos for the modern world by bringing back and synthesizing lots of the Northern European myths, which it's true had been somewhat forgotten from the culture. Tolkien was also involved in bringing back Beowulf, translating Beowulf and bringing it more back into popular circulation. So in Lord of the Rings, he's doing that act of mythopoeia, that act of bringing back a myth. And if you look at the cultural impact of Lord of the Rings from the 1960s onwards, when it really starts to escape into mass culture, not just directly, but the extent to which it's been imitated. If you play a video game, now half of them are set in a Tolkien-esque fantasy land that probably wouldn't be being used now if not for Tolkien.
And certainly Dungeons and Dragons and everything that came from that was a complete ripoff of Tolkien.
There are other people as well, like Jack Vance is a big influence on Dungeons and Dragons, but Tolkien is really the main figure of bringing Middle-earth into our reality as a place. And I speculate in that ninth talk about the extent to which we might be living in Middle-earth in the near future, as we've got our Apple headsets on now, and we can immerse ourselves in these worlds that we're building. I think of them as the unreal that we're bringing into reality. And I think Middle-earth might become a pseudo-real place to us that we spend a lot of time walking around and meeting Tom Bombadil, perhaps, when he shows up.
That would be quite interesting. Yeah, I think started reading the trilogy in 1967. Me and my best friend were reading it sort of side by side and just talking about it constantly. And then, interestingly, that same girl that I read the last question to over the phone, a few years later, she wanted to know about my obsession of Lord of the Rings. And we were out walking around late at night in the summertime, and we sat under a bush on the edge of the woods, and she wanted me to tell her the story of the Lord of the Rings. And I said, how much time you got? And she said, as much as it takes. And by the time I'd probably read it 8 or 9 times, I was reading it every 3 months at that point. So I went to excruciating detail. Hilariously, about midnight, I had gotten the band to Rivendell, and we both fell asleep. And we didn't wake up till the sun came up. And so we had some explaining to do when we got home. And amazingly, my parents actually believed the true story that I told them. I guess they knew me well enough to know. Her parents were somewhat skeptical, but they were on the much more liberal side than my parents, so she didn't get into any trouble. So.
One of those times when you're almost tempted to make up a lie because the truth is so unbelievable.
But it was absolutely true. And, it took me almost 3 hours to get the hobbits to Rivendell, and then we fell asleep. But to the moral question of Lord of the Rings, I love the way you distinguished between Lewis and his heavy Catholic allegory and Tolkien, who, if anything, was an even more fanatic Catholic. But Lord of the Rings, or his whole Middle-earth, is not that at all. It's a parallel creation. One of the reasons I believe that's so important, perhaps what drew me to it, is I became a militant atheist after being raised a Catholic at the age of 11. And so I always recoil from anything that's obviously Christian allegory, God damn it, right? If you're going to tell me fairy stories, label them appropriately. But Lord of the Rings, I read accurately, I think. When I learned more about Tolkien, I realized I intuited his non-allegorical nature. Of course, he says so right in the foreword, though, of course, we know authors often lie about their motives, but that's another story for another day. And my own take on it is that it is a completely alternative metaphysics, right? Iluvatar creates the universe in the beginning, the one, and all that's okay. That's a little bit like old Yahweh pulling a rabbit out of his hat. But after that, the metaphysics is far more complicated and very different. But in this very different metaphysical universe, right and wrong still shine through. You know, the difference between Aragorn and Boromir, or between Gandalf and Saruman, or between Gollum and Frodo, right? I mean, it's an extraordinarily moral work. And so as a militant atheist, I take away from that. You don't need no stinking Yahweh to have morality, right? You can have good and evil and good people, and we can know the difference without having to appeal to some musty old book written in the desert 3,000 years ago. And I think it's one of the reasons I've been such a partisan of his work, despite the fact that he was a fanatic Catholic, because he showed that you didn't need Yahwehism to have morality.
Well, I would actually categorize Tolkien, rather than with most other fantasy writers, which are kind of generic, often copies of Tolkien, are people like the World War I war poets, like Siegfried Sassoon and a number of others, Wilfred Owen. Because the First World War experience clearly shaped a lot of like the sense of loss and grief that's at the heart of Lord of the Rings, the scarring of the landscape, which are also Tolkien's experiences of industrialization, and his sense of what good and evil are. And I think the person he really shared that sensibility with actually is George Orwell. So I sometimes call Lord of the Rings is 1984 plus Hobbits, because they have a lot of the same symbols. So in 1984, Big Brother is an eye that is watching you. You never meet Big Brother. And Sauron is a burning eye who is watching you. And you never see him within the context of the story. And they're both totalitarian powers as well over the world. And you could think of 1984 as kind of a world in which Sauron won, where the totalitarian power has bent everybody else to their will. And like the way that Sauron corrupts the kings of man, the 9 kings who become the Nazgul. So whilst, of course, they're very different stories in many ways, I think their conception of what evil is and how power exerts evil in the world are very, very closely related. And there are people of very, very similar generations, kind of cultural backgrounds as well.
That's interesting. I have to think about that some. I haven't reread 1984 since 1984 when I sat down to read it a second time. So maybe it's due for a third reading. I mean, there's certain aspects of our world today that makes you kind of want to revisit that. But let's move on. One of the things that you have said is that, you know, as the world moves towards more automation, we'll soon, I think, get to AI, you say only a creator culture can save us. What did you mean when you said that?
Yeah, I had been doing early in my career. I went to university in Leicester, which is a great city in the UK, but a very poor city for Britain. It's or was at the time, the poorest city in Britain, big immigrant communities. And I ended up basically as a community worker in Leicester, because whilst I was studying there, I started teaching writing workshops in libraries. And very nicely, the local council basically created a job for me to do that, which I stayed and did for about 7 years in Leicester, working with lots of people who are really isolated and cut off and on the edges of society, working with them to kind of like rebuild identity. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was very young at the time, but it was a very formative experience. And one of the things I came to when I finished that work, I wrote this essay for Eon magazine, that what I had observed is that as people created things, it wasn't about becoming famous, although those kind of drives always come up when people explore their creativity. But as you create something, like if you get to the point where you can write a book or make a painting, something about you actually changes. So We make ourselves through creation. And I was studying a lot of Carl Jung at the time, who had been through this process. He had a famous period of his life where he gave up his professional psychiatric practice, retreated to his kind of tower on the banks of Lake Geneva, and plunged into his imagination and wrote all of the stuff that would become his later theories, which are his most famous work. And from that, I was trying to extrapolate as well, like a political idea about what kind of direction do we need in the world. So that essay proposes that instead of being all about consuming, we need to try and empower people to be creators. Not to be famous, not so everyone is pursuing internet stardom or to be an Instagram influencer, which is what creativity has kind of become about around us, but so that people have that growth and fulfillment. And stuff I'd probably add to that now is that if we look at like our existential problems facing us now, even something like very serious, like the fact that the technology is out there to make chemical weapons in your basement or biological weapons, that we can't authoritarianly push down on that. We need a culture of people who have more and more of the intelligence and wisdom together, that thing John Vervaeke talks about, so that that kind of threat hits a big mesh of creative, super intelligent humans.
Yeah, that's the hope. I mean, and this is an interesting knife's edge, just as Gandalf talks about the quest being on the knife's edge of success or failure. I think the human race is on the knife's edge of success or failure. We have the Game B movement, the whole theory on what we need to build on the other side of this. But it's a very hard road to get from here to there. And, I do think creative culture is certainly part of that, because certainly, if we had the will to not be caught in more consumptive patterns of life, we are already within striking distance of being able to provide a decent standard of living to every human on Earth. I've done some calculations, and just using as a crude surrogate, energy consumption per capita, while not fully inclusive of all the harm we're doing to the ecosystem and to each other and to our psyche, does at least a very rough cut on standard of living and our impact on the ecosystem. And by my calculations, by 2080, we could be producing about 4,000 watts per person for the whole Earth in a carbon neutral or very close to carbon neutral fashion. And you say, well, what's 4,000 watts mean? To give you a sense, the United States, Australia, and Canada, the big offenders, are all around 11 to 12,000 watts, about 3 times that level. Sub-Saharan Africa, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, they're under 500, right? So they're a 20th of the energetic intensity of the United States, Canada, and Australia. Western Europe and Japan, about 8,000. An interesting example for me is Portugal, about 4,000. And Portugal is not a flagrantly rich country, but it's not a depressingly poor country either. People live quite well in Portugal. They haven't used advanced technologies to minimize their energy consumption or anything else. So if everybody on Earth, all 8 billion, by then 9 billion people, 10 billion people, could converge to a world of around 4,000 watts intensity, we could all live like the Portuguese, right? And by that point, much of the actual production and work will be automated. The book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, is really not that far outside of our grasp of humanity, so long as we can get off this more shiny stuff treadmill. And of course, the problem is, what's the alternative, right? Well, if you look back at 95% of human history, the forager epoch, people didn't have possessions because you were moving all the time. The most possession you'd have would be a knife, a spear, and maybe your favorite woven basket with a pot in it. Probably not even a pot. That came later. So it is possible for humans to live without the love of stacking up shiny objects and taking jet trips so they can take selfies on the edge of a cliff or some crazy ass shit like that. And it may be that the creator culture might be that alternative. And certainly it can be for numerous people. We don't know how many. Any thoughts on your side on, if you took 100 people, how many of them would actually find fulfillment in creation?
Yeah, I had a friend who read that essay at the time that I wrote it, and he was a very blunt-spoken Scottishman, and he said to me, but Damien, What about the dimbos? Which was his way of saying, all of those people who are just going out and consuming because they can't find anything else to do. So my optimistic idea is that, and this is genuine observation, that when people find something creative in a very broad sense that engages them, they really begin more and more to opt out of consumption because that thing is channeling all of their attention. I observed this a lot on the internet, especially at the time when kind of older people were joining the internet who were really deep into consumption. But when they found like the sports community that they were into and they got some status in that community, so that was a little bit creative for them, they'd be much less interested in whatever consumptive patterns they had. You have a big trend in the UK of young people not drinking or going out to pubs.
Yeah, who the hell would have thought that? The damn Brit who are the worst sots on earth, pretty much, right? But now it's a trend amongst the young people to be dry.
It's because young people have other things to do. They've grown up playing Minecraft online. And of course, a lot of them are just doing those negative things online, which I won't list at the moment. But a lot of it is very positive and creative. They have massive friend groups, massive collaborative projects. They're involved with huge games. It might be a pseudo form of creativity at that stage, but it's still the experience of creativity. So I think we're probably going in this direction, and I think humans naturally are creators. But we've had a solid 300 years of industrial culture where everybody needs to be trained to just conform to a system. But now those systems are quickly falling apart, and AI is probably going to smash them apart. I think AI, my current take on it, because who really knows how it's going to evolve, is that it will empower creativity rather than doing the creativity. I think there's great use. I know that you're working with, you've been doing script writing. Can you actually auto-generate an entire script?
Yeah, though this is interesting, and I've now got a small group of collaborators, including a couple of people from Hollywood and a semi-pro script writer. In fact, it was he and I came up with this idea together. And what the main focus, you're absolutely right, is intimately interwoven with a person in lots and lots of intricate steps to be able to create a full script, but with the writer or the human in the loop in many, many places. However, I also found that you can go from what's called the movie hint, which could be as little as 3 sentences, to a full script with the press of a button. It's not the greatest script in the world, but people looked at it and say, not terrible, right? But I will say, if you're going to get a really good script, you got to have the human in the loop in multiple places. But the AI takes care of a tremendous amount of the hard work. And it also, and this is, I think, where this is potentially a bigger potential product than one might think. There are many people who are creative in the space of ideas and understand what an interesting character is and an interesting plot, but they are not fluid with written words. They're not writers, but they're thinkers and they're storytellers in the oral tradition. Think about our forager, 95% of our history. The shaman who or the storyteller around the campfire wasn't somebody who had done enough writing to have a very nice writing style. They had a different way of crafting story. And so my thought is that things like my script helper program and similar things, which are coming for other genres, will open the door for creativity to people who have ideas and deep felt sense of right and wrong and what character ought to be and maybe understand folk psychology, but don't have the technical skills to write beautiful prose or even to structure complicated prose. And if you combine Script Helper with what's coming soon, which is text to video, people will actually be able to create actual video artifacts from a relatively small amount of written words and iterative interaction with tools like Script Helper. And I think that'd be quite interesting. In fact, yesterday I did a podcast with Rob Tursik, a Hollywood guy. And his prediction is that Hollywood is doomed and doesn't know it because the world is about to be overwhelmed with vast quantities of non-copyrighted but pretty good material. And of course, Sturgeon's law, 90% of everything is shit. But if there's 1 million custom-made movies created, 100,000 of them aren't shit. And maybe 10,000 of them are actually good. And you consider that Hollywood puts out 300 or 400 movies a year. If there's 10,000 pretty good ones that come from the commons, shall we say, and are not copyrighted, they're in the commons, will there be any room left for Hollywood, or will most people find something in this 10,000 good ones out of the million that are created, and 95% of their video consumption will be there from a commons. And as you say, not for people trying to be rich, but rather for people who have a story to tell and hope that somebody will pick it up, but they don't even get any remuneration for it, or very modest remuneration, but for the joy of the act of creation. That would be a very interesting and different world than this world where the video that we consume is created in part to program us to stay within the culture of consumption and material status games. There'll always be status games in society. We are chimpanzees and bonobos who wear clothes, so we will always be playing status games, but they don't have to be about shiny objects and stacking up money. You can have a status game of who's the best storyteller, who's got the deepest spirituality, who can make a fire by rubbing two sticks together, who's good with archery. There's many, 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 many dimensions of status competition, which we have foolishly allowed to be collapsed to basically two, which are money and beauty, right? That collapse to those two things is, to my mind, fairly close to what is driving our society over the cliff. And I'm with you that I think that a creator culture is at least a piece of finding our way across this knife's edge to the other side.
Going down that optimistic route, like I think Hollywood, not because there's two things happening in Hollywood. There's some really brilliant creators who I greatly admire, and then there's a whole industry that is built around them. And the industry, I think everybody is sick of at this point. So I talk quite a lot on the science fiction podcast about the corporate entertainment franchise, which is what sadly has happened to things like Star Wars and Star Trek, and criminally like Lord of the Rings, is that they're treated by these big corporate entities as something that they can buy and sell, like a chain of coffee shops or fast food. So it is literally a franchise of that kind. And their only interest, of course, is in building up the value of the franchise.
I was so pissed off by the newest Lord of the Rings series that was put out. It was like the worst piece of shit imaginable. The first episode was like, oh my God, maybe it'll get better. Maybe it was the pilot. And it got worse. It violated all the ethos of Tolkien. It was like, what the fuck? How could this be considered to be part of the Middle Earth thing? And I have, even though I am the most fanatic Tolkienian most people I know, I have said I am not going to watch season 2 of the goddamn thing when it comes out. I've even watched all the goddamn Hobbit movies, which aren't that good, but they're at least good enough and they don't violate the ethos of the world.
There's some good moments. Bilbo and Gollum is pretty great in the Hobbit movies. And I think the edit that just makes it one movie is pretty good, actually.
That would be worthwhile. Cook it all down to about 3 hours instead of taking what should have been 1 3-hour movie and turning it into 2.5-hour movies. But anyway, yeah, to turn these things into literal commodities and think about what happens in a late stage financialized capitalist economy is the only value anything has its ability to squeeze money on money return out of it. No other value is allowed to survive under the pressure of that machine. And to desecrate these great works of art that way is just horrifying.
I think they're going to lose, though, to exactly the things we're talking about here. So do you know Games Workshop? It's very UK-centric, Warhammer 40,000. So it's a big tabletop gaming set 40,000 years in the future.
I know about the game, yeah, because we have a little nerd store about 2 blocks down for where our in-town pied-à-terre is. That's all they do is Warhammer or whatever it is, 40,000 or something. They have all the stuff they're selling. They got tables set up with, hairy and dirty nerds crouched around them, 12 hours a day. It's pretty crazy. Is it worth looking into? Is it good?
Well, what's happened is that the fans are much more creative about Warhammer than Games Workshop is. So they 3D print their own miniatures from patterns which are shared in the fandom, and things like Unreal Engine. So if you look on YouTube, there's all kinds of Warhammer animated movies from non-Games Workshop people. And really, when you think about it, the fans really own the franchise, but legally it's still owned by Games Workshop, and they will chase people down from making these movies sometimes. But I think Hollywood is just going to lose this battle, especially with things like AI, because I don't think it's going to be really about making a 90-minute movie or a 3-hour movie. We're moving into a video game, virtual world reality. But those games won't for a very long time be self-generating. They're going to be massive creations of huge collaborative groups of people. So a major form of storytelling, and already is in things like Minecraft, but this will become very common, is your level in a game, the adventure that you've designed and the NPCs that people meet. And because of the bulk, that will be something that AI will contribute to helping people write. And a lot of it, of course, will be trash via Sturgeon's law, and people won't go to those parts of the game. But some of it will be brilliant, and millions of people will go on those quests and follow those stories and those level designs. And I think what people really want is to have the freedom to do that, if that's their form of creativity in the world once they find it, rather than having to turn up for whatever kind of meaningless cubicle job they're doing, which is probably just contributing to one of these corporate structures, and feel frustrated that they can't just put their time into making these worlds. Or I don't think it's just going to be games either. I think we're going to have huge collaborative science projects, a bit like the SETI project, where people were processing star data on their computer for all kinds of things, where we're processing massive amounts of data to make huge discoveries as well. And that's what humans should be doing.
Norbert Wiener's famous book, The Humane Use of Human Beings, right? He was an early father and writer about cybernetics, and he saw it back in the early 50s that the potential was there, but I think he didn't understand. And I think John Maynard Keynes famously said in the 30s that by the 60s we'll be down to working 15 hours a week due to the fruits of automation. And what neither of them could see was the ability of the money on money machine to hijack our brains and program us to think in terms of our status, in terms of our possessions or our positional goods. Or the beauty game. The beauty game, I really feel sorry for the teenage girls now who are caught in this absurd beauty loop on Instagram with the arms race of these artificial beautifiers. And think about how weird that would be if you've highly identified yourself with your Instagram presentation of yourself that's highly manipulated by beautifying filters, and then you look in the mirror in the morning. What does that do to you? And so no wonder there's a skyrocketing epidemic of mental health amongst teenage females, at least in the Anglosphere. I don't know why it's worse in the Anglosphere than elsewhere, but it seems to be. And again, this is not a good and healthy thing. But if you are a advertising supported vehicle that wants to have you on the system as long as possible, rather than for you to get the maximized benefit for what you're paying for, then that's what you'll end up with. Money on money return will say, let us build a culture and a cult of teenage girls obsessing over their beauty, getting into an arms race with beauty filters, and then feeling horrible about themselves when they look in the mirror. I mean, that's the fucked up result of the system we have today.
Yeah. An aspect of creativity is that to get to a point where you can fulfill yourself creatively, it usually means unpicking lots of addictions, which I don't mean in like the chemical addiction sense, although that's often part of it as well, but any kind of addictive behavior in your life. So for lots of young men at the moment, the two main things between them and their potential in life are addictive video games and pornography online, which are both media phenomenon, basically. And these are incredibly powerful, like the tools of gamification that are deployed in video games. I'm going to do a big video essay on this for people, because I don't think especially the young men who are caught in these traps understand what the games are doing at all. How like gamified Even like the application of meaning. So you can give people the fake sense of meaning and achievement in a game to keep them coming back to the game over and over again. And it's not like the days where like there were a small subset of young men when I was a kid who would play like fruit machines, gambling machines in pubs. This is much more powerful than that. And it can get almost anyone who falls into these traps online. And these are all the same tools of creativity. The things that you might use to create great art can also be used to create these addictive loops that you keep people in for your profit.
Yeah, your money on money return by hijacking people's dopamine signals. One of the worst things I ever heard in my life was from one of the big wheels in Silicon Valley. I always call it Silicon Valley intentionally, just to show how fake it all is, right? To give the analogy to fake tits, that his view of the world is, oh yeah, most people will be reduced to something like a proletariat state. There'll be waiters and bartenders and baristas at Starbucks, but they'll be able to come home and get into the fully strapped on virtual reality and have a castle and drive a Lamborghini. And that's how we'll keep the proles down. And I go, dude, man, I think if I had a guillotine company, I would use that as my ad, right? I'd have rolling guillotines mounted on casters that you could push through the street, and that would be my marketing material right there.
Yeah, I don't know who's going to win this contest.
We're at a knife's edge, as Gandalf warned us. We are not guaranteed to win at all.
Maybe that's why I come back to myth so often in science fiction, because I think for me, when I was very lost as a younger man, science fiction was one of the things that helped me find a way out of that, because the stories are so powerful. So something like The Matrix, what you're being told in The Matrix is quite true. There's a lot of great symbolism in there about the situation that you kind of find yourself in as a standard human being in our capitalist society. So much of it is interwoven with these control mechanisms to make you a battery. And it's very difficult to say this stuff directly. Like I do a lot of work as a critic, and I know that like there's a certain point of, if what I'm saying directly, literally in criticism, broke through a certain point, I get lots and lots of attack from that. And at some point the attack would probably become unbearable, I guess. I've been Twitter dogpiled few times in the past, but much on from that. Whereas myth and storytelling can work much more powerfully to get past that.
Interesting. Now, one interesting thing about The Matrix, as you say, it is allegorically very interesting, but I am a little put off by the fact that red pills has been hijacked, essentially mean become wise to the ways of misogyny or something like that. I go, what the hell? The guys that did, now gals, I guess, that did The Matrix would not be pleased with that use of the concept at all, I do not believe.
Yeah, that's a really interesting phenomenon of this. So you got there's a number of these, but that's probably the main one. So The Matrix has been picked up by people like Andrew Tate.
I vaguely know who it is, not in my world, but apparently is the number one biggest influencer, at least was, where he got slammed, of like 14-year-old boys, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's other people I could name, but if you name them in this kind of podcast, it's like summoning them. So I don't want to bring them all to your podcast, Jim. But and there's a lot of these people out there who are selling to these young men who are trapped in video games and porn, basically. The idea that there is this thing like The Matrix and there is this red pill you can take to get out of it, but then they associate it to this very reactionary value set, which is much easier to understand. That the problem is, and this has always been a phenomenon, so the problem is like this tiny number of transgender cultural critics who get an incredible amount of attack from these kind of Reddit type communities, 4chan type communities, because this is how difficult the knife edge is that we're on, that even the experience of awakening from The Matrix can be subverted into a kind of money-making scam.
Oh man, just look at all the self-help gurus out there and TikTok influencers. Again, they're all trying to scamify what John Vervaeke. In fact, they're the highest rated shows ever on my podcast. I had him on for 10 hours where we did his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is a 50-hour video series. We cooked it down to about 10 hours, of very intense audio. I must say, I am impressed as shit that my audience loves those episodes, because when I made them, I famously spend 10 hours on average researching each episode that I do. I spent about 30 hours researching each one of those 5 episodes, and they are extremely deep. And the top 2 episodes of all my episodes are both from that series, and all 5 of them are in the top 17. So kudos to the Jim Rutt Show audience for having the depth to go with John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series. But yes, if the money on money machine is what transmutes all values to shit, it can even transmit the idea of awakening from the meaning crisis to shit, unfortunately. Now, games, let's talk about games a little bit. When I was a really intense gamer from age of 10 to about 22, but they were all tabletop games. They were mostly the Avalon Hill war games, the little square pieces with the military unit symbols on them. And I even developed some. Being a friend of mine created some. I created one of the first Lord of the Rings Risk variants and printed a few copies and had friends do it. But they were all on tabletops, and they were all very social, right? I have dabbled a little bit over the years in computer games, almost not at all on console games. But none of them, for me, ever had the magic of the tabletop games with, 5 people around a table, arguing and making fun of each other and what have you. But turning it into a solitary pursuit seems to have been perhaps the thing that allowed it to become this highly addicting thing. And of course, moving from tabletop with very abstract, here's my army as a little square piece with a tank tread on it, to actually being 5 feet away from a tank shooting a flamethrower, and you have your anti-tank gun and you shoot the tank and it blows up. Very much more immersive kinds of things than my days of gaming addiction. I was never addicted because it's not that addicting when it's at that level of abstraction. But when it's at this deeper level, it gets the hooks in much deeper.
Yeah, well, there's 2 kinds of game in any really successful game. The classic example of this is the high scoreboard on an arcade machine. And the realization by the game companies that you had Space Invaders or whatever the game was, Street Fighter 2 was the one for my generation. And I would go to the arcade to play the game, but actually because I wanted my name on that high scoreboard. So there's the graphically represented game, and then there's all the actual game structures underneath that. And if you look at the games today, it's the game structures underneath. Things like loot crates in big online battle royale games. And that keys into a number of kind of cognitive biases that people have. You're kind of training people in a Pavlovian response so that they don't know what's going to be in the box, and usually it's lower value than what they're paying for it, and it's all digital goods anyway, but sometimes it's going to pay out something really big, and everything in the game is therefore just a massive addiction engine. And this is something that, John Vervaeke or someone similarly skilled could dig into much more deeply. I'm aware of it on a kind of creator's level. And someone who had to unaddict myself from these games many years ago now, but I had a pretty addictive gaming habit for Counter-Strike at the time, which I played for months solidly. And that had all of these game structures built into it as well. But I think a large part of the answer is awareness to them. The first step is understanding that these addictive behavior shaping techniques are all being deployed in these games.
Yeah, that's interesting. If you're right about the future being a creator's world where people become more and more immersed in the creations of peers, maybe the 1% that's good out of the free space, perhaps going to be important that we find some way to help guide people or nudge people or even regulate such that dopamine hijacking is not the principal aim of these things. But unfortunately, even if all you're interested in is fame, and you're not going to get paid, If you have something that's very, very dopamine hijacking, you'll have 1 million users as opposed to the kind of the sweeter, softer, or more brutal, but less intentionally dopamine hijacking alternatives. What do you think about that? The ecosystem that favors the exact kinds of exploits, even in a non-commercial world.
Yeah, I struggle with this as a teacher, for instance, teacher of writing and storytelling. That, in fact, my course is called The Rhetoric of Story because it's the least marketing type title that I could give it. And it is literally what it's about as well. And it has been very successful, actually, which is surprising in some ways. And I do have some structures in there, like I structure around 7 foundations of storytelling. So that would be quite a simple communication strategy to make it a list in that way, but that's kind of a bit of a compromise. But in the online teaching space, it's the worst teaching which will sell the best in many ways. So in the writing space, it's things like how to write 5,000 words a day for your book. And it just teaches these kind of very routine techniques that an AI can definitely do to kind of crank out prose for your self-publishing books, because it appeals to a much lower desire in people that we can just have the outcome. So we always have to remember that it is about who we are as humans as well. We're very biased towards simple solutions and getting things without putting in the work, getting the honey at the top of the tree that somebody else has done the climbing for. But once we recognize that, then you can actually start to consciously work around it. But it's deeply frustrating, I find it, as a teacher, it's also about where you position yourself in relation to the worst player on a field. There's the most virtuous player and the most evil player. And the most virtuous player is doomed to lose. So you have to position yourself somewhere realistically that you can compete with the spectrum of bad players who are out there as well.
In our game B theory, we call that the multipolar trap, where the example I like to use is, let's imagine we're in the soft drink business in 1978, and we all sell soft drinks with cane sugar in them. And again, we're going to hypothesize that high fructose corn syrup is worse for you. The scientific evidence isn't clear, but let's assume that it is. Archer Daniel Midland's corporation has a chemical engineering breakthrough, and they can now manufacture high fructose corn syrup for 1/3 the price of cane sugar. But nobody switches in the soft drink world because they've all been cane sugar traditionalists. But one guy does switch. He's been taken over by private equity, let's say, and is nothing but about the bottom line. And so he switches out. His costs, sugar being by far the number one ingredient, drop by half. He can now outcompete and have higher profit margin or lower price and gain market share against everybody else. And they're all forced to respond with the same action. So even though they didn't really want to, they're forced to by one bad actor. And you see that again and again and again. That fits exactly your case. If all were virtuous teachers of writing, then they could all be virtuous teachers of writing. But if that is not an evolutionary stable strategy, as we say in evolutionary theory, if an invader comes into your space with schlock, write 5,000 words a day and write a bestseller, or, here are the 5 rules for all writing. I've seen all that crap, as you have, no doubt, on online ads. And that actually outcompetes virtuous, rhetorically founded theories of writing, then you have a problem. And so one of the things we struggle with in the game B world is, what are the principles by which a commons can expel invaders and not tolerate the invaders, rather than force all the players in any given activity to respond by becoming like the worst players in the category? And I will say, we do not yet have an answer, but we have identified it as one of the key problems for building the world that comes after the one we're living in.
Maybe Tolkien understood some of this on the most intuitive level, because something that he's talking about in Lord of the Rings is the way that evil eats itself. Over time, it consumes itself. And you see this, like in Hollywood at the moment, as it has become much more of a corporate enterprise, I think the idea of independent filmmakers competing in like the 1970s when Hollywood was at its peak and it was making amazing films alongside lots of trash as well would have been difficult. But now what comes out of Hollywood is so terrible that there's space for the independent creators to move through and make something new. So I suspect that we have this cycle between the worst players on the field who at some point will come to dominate, and then they end up eating themselves because their audience has opted out and space emerges for new things to crop up around them. I doubt we can ever end the cycle and just have the good stuff, though.
Anyone who puts out a utopian anything, be highly suspicious. It ends up as Pol Pot every time, right? Complexity will tell us that we'll never get full answers to anything. It's always an unfolding to the next level. So I think you're kind of interesting there. Let's wrap up with one thing I would love to get your thoughts on. As you no doubt could infer from our discussion, I at least used to be a very heavy science fiction reader. In fact, that's what I mostly read. There was a time when I read, I believe, every science fiction book that was published in hardcover and hence showed up at our public library. And then later, when I had my paper route and a little bit of money, I discovered used bookstores where you could buy copies of Analog for a nickel and you could buy pulp science fiction books for a dime. And I would buy them by the stack and read them. But over time, my reading of science fiction has gone down to maybe 1 or 2 or 3 a year. Most recent one I read that I was quite impressed with, in fact, I had him on my podcast quite recently, was Daniel Suarez's recent one, Critical Mass and Delta V. They're 2 linked stories about the early days of mankind moving into space, and they were very, very good. In fact, they fit into the category, we unfortunately didn't have time to dig into this, what you called a systems novel, where he envisions a whole new way that the economy might work and the politics might work, and it's very innovative. But anyway, that aside, Daniel Suarez, his 2 books I really like. What would you recommend as current science fiction that's of the highest quality? I'm going to put the critic on the spot and have him come up with some of his, what he thinks are really good sci-fi that are, say, within the last 12 months or so.
Well, I'm not reading a lot of new science fiction.
Oh, you're arguing about the old stuff, right?
I've gone back to a lot of old stuff, like reading the whole Dune sequence to talk about systems theory novels, which I think that defines systems theory science fiction. That's why it's so influential. I'll give you one, which I think will appeal to your audience, which is by Quantum, QNTM, who does have a real name, but he chooses to publish pseudonymously. And the book is called There Is No Anti-Memetics Division.
Oh, I read that. It's pretty whack. It's way out there stylistically, but it was curious and interesting. I don't think I finished it, actually, I'll confess. I'm about a 75% finisher of books that I started, but that was one I did not finish because the style was just too whack.
Yeah, it has a kind of episodic style that might not be for everybody who reads it. But I think some of the ideas in there are probably ideas that will become quite mainstream in science fiction.
I love the core concept, actually, the core theme. And then once I got the theme, I said, all right, I'm done. So let's spend our last 5 minutes talking about the idea of systems. What did you call them?
Systems novels. I think it was quite a long time ago I wrote that.
Why don't you lay out that idea and maybe give some examples and why you think it's an important formalism?
Well, you have a point in philosophy where a lot of philosophers, I'm definitely an armchair philosopher, so I speak inexpertly here, but I think Heidegger was one of these who came to a point in his thinking about philosophy that he really decided it could only really happen through art, that philosophy just kind of went round in these linguistic cycles otherwise. And he wrote a lot of poetry at that point. And I think a lot about actually the embodiment of philosophy in story gives you science fiction. I think you could almost call science fiction philosophy fiction in a way. So in something like Dune, although there's definitely science and scientific extrapolation in there, I think it's more about kind of thinking about ecology and the systems, how systems, complex systems of those kinds, are going to shape and evolve over time, how those are tied into human evolution. And Herbert spends a hell of a lot of time just having his characters sitting around thinking about the future of humanity, the kind of arc of the planet Arrakis becoming the water world and then going back to the desert world again. And all of these, I think, are deep philosophical concepts and system thinkers' concepts. But I think what happens in terms of putting those in fiction actually takes you a step beyond like systems thinking and systems theory, because they have to become embodied. Whatever systems you're thinking of have to be embodied in people and then seen through the eyes of characters and then made into a story that is believable and immersive for the readers, which takes you that leap beyond where systems theory so often struggles with just proliferating systems, because you can identify like an infinite number of systems in the world for any finite thing you might want to look at. But the test of the system is how it comes back to the human scale. And if you can place it into a story, which then gives you a work of science fiction, I think that is actually an intellectual test for it. Does that make sense, Jim?
Yeah, it does. One I read last year, which I was pretty taken with, was Neal Stephenson's Termination Shock. Again, it was a really good story and some interesting and quirky characters, but it was also a fairly good explication of geoengineering and climate change and coupling between the two, and what could really go badly wrong with climate change, what are some of the risks and some of the benefits of geoengineering. So it was a mixture of serious thinking about systems and a good fun story.
I think it's his trilogy, the Systems of the World trilogy. The first one is Quicksilver, and it's also related to Cryptonomicon.
Oh, I hated those. Oh, dear, did I hate those.
You hated them?
Yes. In fact, I refer to them as the Broke cycle, B-R-O-K-E. He calls them the Baroque cycle.
What did you hate about them?
Everything, particularly the writing style and the fact that the history is all totally and grossly falsified. I happen to know a lot about that era of Boyle and Newton and all that stuff. And it's like, ah! And it's funny, I've read every book he's written and I've enjoyed them all except for those three. It's one of the very few cases, I think it was the second one, you hear people say they threw a book against the wall. Well, about halfway through, I literally took this gigantic tome, and they're all huge and thick. This was in hardcover, and I threw it against the wall, and it actually put a dent in the sheetrock. So anyway, but I know other people think they're his best work. So, taste is individual.
I won't judge them on quality there. I think as systems novels, they're very interesting. But I email interviewed Neal Stephenson some years ago, and I would send him a question, quite a long question, like like a paragraph, half a page of email or something. And I would get an email back from him that was 3,000 words long about 7 minutes later in answer to the question. So I think, because he's very prolific, I think Neal Stephenson can write at the speed that he thinks. Since then, when I've read his novels, I can tell the sections where he's writing fiction, and he's a very skilled fiction writer. And then there are other sections where he just switches over into, this is just Neal Stephenson brain dumping onto the page.
Yeah, even in Termination Shock, there's some of that where he goes into a deep dive into explaining something, and he does it really well. I mean, he is a very talented wordsmith. And I've enjoyed all of his books with the exception of the Broke cycle. But I know other people think those are their favorites, right? So to each his own. All righty. Well, I think this has been a right interesting conversation with Damien Walter. Thanks for coming on the Jim Rutt Show.
Thanks for inviting me, Jim.
Yeah, it was really a lot of fun. Audio production and editing by Andrew Blevins Productions. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.